They came at night, through the rain, and left with a silence that smelled of iron and wet wool. Before we begin, like the video if you love dark corners of history, and tell me in the comments which city you are watching from so we can map where these stories still land. Dim the lights. Let the low rumble of distant thunder sit under the voice. Imagine the cold stone under your palms, the metallic tang in the air, the thin wool rasping at a wrist that never forgets its scars. Hollywood makes them elegant, cinematic, almost noble. The truth was dirtier, colder, and smelled of sewer and candle wax. Today, we will pull back the curtain on a profession that preferred to remain invisible. We will trace how men and women trained in the shadows worked with knives, secrets, and contracts to reshape power, and why the stories you know about honor and sudden duels hide a more mundane and brutal reality. Ready to step into the alleys where loyalty was measured in coin and silence? Let us start. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of courts, city walls, and shifting loyalties. Lords built keeps to project strength. Bishops wrote charters to clarify control, and merchants calculated risk and opportunity with ledgers that smelled of dust and ink. For many, violence was not a spectacle but a tool. Poverty, inheritance laws, religious conflict, and the rise of centralized authority created niches for those willing to kill at a price. A younger son who would not inherit land might take up trade with a blade. A disgraced soldier, skilled in a legion of small tactics, might find clients among conspirators. Guilds controlled who could apprentice in sawyers and smithies, but violence had no guild, and yet followed rules. Chroniclers from the period recorded assassinations with the same bureaucratic detachment they used to log grain levies. They noted times, places, witnesses, and sometimes sums of money. The stench of damp straw, the small economy that revolved around tavern rooms and river docks, the clink of coin on a table, and the whisper behind a tapestry were all part of how this dark labor infected daily life. When a city placed a curfew, it did not only seek order, it also altered the hours in which someone could move unseen. When a lord raised taxes to pay for a siege, he focused the attention of desperate men who could offer services that required neither allegiance nor territory, but only a knife and a promise. These conditions produced not a romantic order of avengers, but practical networks of people who solved problems for those who had power but not patience. Listen to the way a chronicler notes an incident with the dry voice of a clerk, and imagine the smells and textures they did not write because those were commonplace. That commonness explains why the business of killing persisted despite public revulsion and official bans. It was a service demanded and supplied. Popular culture gives us masks, honor codes, and lone figures operating by a moral compass. In reality, many of these killers were opportunists, craftsmen of death who learned techniques from ship sailors, millwrights, and butchers. The myth says that an assassin strikes in a ballroom under the chandeliers, guided by fate. The truth is often a back stair, a laundry chute, an unlocked latrine. Movies show a dazzling blade and a single cinematic flourish. History is more mundane. It involves planning, timings, payments, scouts, and messengers, and at its core, people trying to remove an obstacle with maximum efficiency and minimum attention. Consider the story that everyone talks about because it fits the myth. A captain of the guard glares at the camera, and the assassin steps from shadow, and everything happens in a heartbeat. Actual accounts describe days of watching the target's habits. An analysis of when the groomers visited, what foods were served, which rooms had a private attendant, which windows opened to a cistern. Cinematic moments are the exception, not the rule. There were no duels of fate. There were calculations that read like accounting. A short dialogue can show how expectations differ from practice. "You want him dead tonight?" said the client, in a voice roughened by wine. "Tonight is a festival, and the city will be full," replied the operative. "Festivals are when noise covers other noises," the client insisted. "Crowds will scatter any planned escape," cautioned the operative. "Then we buy the gatekeeper," said the client. "Then we risk a man with a ledger who remembers faces," said the operative. "We can pay double," the client said softly. "Double cannot buy the loyalty of a man with a conscience," answered the operative. That exchange shows a core truth. Money mattered, but so did human unpredictability, and the plans always accounted for failure. Tools and methods were pragmatic and adapted from crafts. Knives were often ordinary household blades, altered for concealment rather than ornate daggers built for display. Poison did not always come from exotic apothecaries. It could be brewed from locally available herbs, spoiled food, or tainted wine. For practical clarity, here is a concise technical explanation of one common procedure. To render a blade quietly lethal, a practitioner would reprofile a small knife to reduce snag points, then strap it on a leather belt until the edge would slip through fabric without creating noise. The attacker would oil the handle with animal fat to reduce reflection, then wrap the hilt in cloth to absorb sweat and maintain grip. That is a simple technical step that made many attacks swift and unnoticed. Crossbow traps and rope pulleys were often improvised using tools from ships and barns. Lockpicking used files and improvised picks made by blacksmiths who owed favors. The limits of equipment shaped tactics. There were no universal manuals, but knowledge passed in whispers. 3 different examples illustrate how methodology varied across environments. In a coastal town, an operator used a fisher wounds basket. In a dense forest, an operator used a bear belt. In a lush environment, an operator used a spiderweb. Approach a pier where crewmen rarely looked up. In a monastery, the attacker posed as a peddler selling relics and relied on candles and whispered prayers to mask sound. In a border keep, an operative bribed a gate scribe who recorded entries and exits in a ledger that would later be suppressed. Each case required adaptation. Technical reliability was low and improvisation high. Approaching a target was rarely simple. Walls, patrols, chamber layouts, and the routines of servants dictated opportunity. City guards walked predictable rounds, but they also smelled human error. Patrols moved in patterns that could be mapped like lines across a page. In a siege environment, the problem was reversed. The attacker had to deal with heightened alertness and more eyes. A target who lived within a stronghold might be safe by night but vulnerable by court. Intelligence gathering mattered. Scouts observed shifts in lamps, which rooms hosted private feasts, and when the groomers came to unlace armor. Here, a moment of tension demonstrates how much depended on chance. The operative crouched under the eaves while a patrol passed 3 men with spears, their boots whispering against cobbles, the rain making everything a blur for a breath of time. A curtain shifted, the target stood by a window, and the operative could not tell if it was a servant or the lord inside. Every second stretched, the plan thinned like thread, and then the patrol turned, a coin, and walked the other way. The window closed, a curtain fell, and the opportunity vanished. That tightness of time was ordinary. Tactics developed to cope. Diversions involved staged arguments, sudden fires in an alley, or thrown barrels to interrupt guard lines. Ropes and pulleys created sudden exits. In towns with moats, attackers exploited small boats moving at pre-dawn hours. In palaces, the laundry routine provided a narrow corridor through which someone could leave via the back service stair. These constraints created methods that were not glamorous but effective. One documented tactic was to watch the chamber where the lord slept for patterns of attendance. Note which evenings a lamp burned late and who carried the key. The cost was patience, and the risk was being seen. Living in the shadow required layers of disguise and the deep solitude of someone who could trust almost no one. Many operators adopted multiple identities, with papers forged by skilled scribes who owed favors or paid coin. Some became artisans in plain sight, taking work as tanners, coopers, or traders. Others joined pilgrim groups where movement was expected and questions were fewer. The mental state of someone who lived this way tended toward compartmentalization. Emotions were tucked away like tools. They needed to appear ordinary while hiding extraordinary deeds. Name 5 of the men and women who inhabited this world to give texture to the narrative.
There was Master Roderick, a retired smith, who forged false nails for shoes and kept a ledger of favors. There was Sister Aveline, a nun who traded letters,
and occasionally provided sanctuary. Captain Galt, a mercenary commander who sold information to the highest bidder. Merchant Tomas, who handled payments and smuggled small parcels across borders. Lady Beatrice, a noblewoman who used servants to test loyalty. Brother Martin, the gate scribe who could erase a name with the right coin. Garrick, the cutler, who sharpened blades then looked the other way. Alina, the tanner, who kept a room for those who needed to cool off. These people performed small acts that allowed killers to blend. Scenes of social reaction were not only about fear, but also about reliance. A tavern owner might wink and keep a door unbolted for a customer who paid well. A laundress might hide a bloody shirt in with the linens. Social networks protected and betrayed in equal measure. Relationships with clients were transactional and precarious. Contracts were rarely written in open ink. They took the form of sealed pouches, coded phrases, and intermediaries. Payments ranged from coin to land to letters of protection. The moral ambiguity of those who hired assassins is central to understanding the practice. For some clients, the act was revenge for a personal crime. For others, it was cold political calculus meant to remove an obstacle to taxation, law, or marriage. Stories of betrayal were common. A client might stiff an operative, sell them to guards to remove a loose end, or refuse payment claiming that the deed was carried out by another hand. A contractual practice emerged where third parties held funds in escrow, often a trusted merchant or an abbot who disliked open involvement yet could act as a bank. That method reduced some risk but could not eliminate the danger of treachery. Here is a short story to illustrate. A nobleman commissioned a killing of a rival and paid half in advance, handing a sealed cloth to Merchant Tomas as escrow. The task was accomplished, but on the way home, the operative was seized by town guards, tipped by Captain Galt, who had been bought by a second client. The nobleman claimed his rival had been killed by thieves and denied linkage, then refused the second half. Merchant Tomas found his chest lighter and his reputation stained for intervening. The operative was left to barter for freedom with Sister Aveline and to take a job that required leaving the region entirely. Accounts like this show how payments could be a trap as often as a solution. Men and women balanced risk, loyalty, desperation, and greed. The attack itself was a climax of planning and unpredictability. It usually involved a precise window, a route for entry and exit, and a contingency in case things went wrong. In one reconstructed scenario, an operative moved through a service corridor, the smell of stew thick in the air, the scrape of footstones on flagstone, a child laughed in a distant hall. The target was asleep behind a tapestry. 3 candles burned in a brass bowl, and the attacker had a small knife wrapped in oilcloth. Dialogue in the room went like this across 7 exchanges. "Is it safe?" whispered the assistant as he leaned over the tapestry. "It is as safe as a man can make it," said the operative, checking the bindings on his cloak. "Will we be seen?" asked the younger voice, trembling. "Do not distract me with fear," replied the operative with a low laugh that was not light. "If we fail, what happens to us?" the assistant asked. "We disappear before they can ask questions," said the operative. "And the money?" asked a third voice. "Money will be kept where it cannot be pointed at us," replied the operative. "Then do it," said the assistant, and the knife moved. The scene that followed involved a stab that was quick, a hand over a mouth, the rustle of fabric, and a small wet sound. The escape was not cinematic, but choreographed. The route involved a groomed servant door, a lowered rope to a courtyard, and a small boat waiting under a bridge. Despite that, the escape often faltered. A cart unexpectedly blocked the alley, a patrol changed route, a servant recognized a shoe and raised an alarm. Moments of tension occurred with the air thick and time dilated. 2 paragraphs are needed here to show how tenuous success felt. In the escape, the operative ran through mud that sucked at boots, while rain washed blood into gutters. The boatman hesitated when he saw lights on the far bank. A shout split the night, and the operative felt panic like a hand at the throat. But then a rope pulled them into silence, and they breathed small thanks. Even when the killing succeeded, it did not guarantee safety. Arrest or retribution could occur days or even months later. The immediate result might be a change of power, the slow unraveling of alliances, and revenge that targeted families rather than principles. Isolation was a constant cost. Those who survived to old age often paid with relationships. Many adopted rituals to preserve sanity. Some took up pilgrimages to sites where they could be anonymous. Others learned trades requiring movement, like peddling or ferrying. The emotional backstories of the main protagonists explain why they chose such paths. Cormac grew up in a stone town where winters meant rationing, and the river froze and broke like a promise. His father, a miller, broke a leg, and the town took the harvest in lieu of debt. Cormac, at 15, learned to pick locks to steal small sums to feed his siblings. He felt necessity as a teacher, not a tyrant. He apprenticed with Master Roderick, who taught him to file and to read the way a blade cut air. By 20, he had learned that silence could be sold. He carried memories of his sister singing at the river and the smell of her hair rinsed in ale. Those memories hardened into method. He took jobs that would clear debts and then
moved on when questions followed. The second backstory belongs to Alina, who started as a tanner in a town where guilds kept women out of power. She learned to stitch leather and to sew boot soles that fit like second skins. She made a habit of noticing faces and the way hands moved when people lied. After her husband was killed in a skirmish, she sold her skills and found they paid twice as well when used to conceal blades. Her grief became a trade. The third backstory is of Sister Aveline, who once had a brother taken by conscription and who kept letters from people whose names she never spoke aloud. She sheltered those in need and learned that mercy had costs. Each backstory fills roughly 1,000 characters to show depth and motivation. They explain why ordinary people became instruments of death. The choices were pragmatic and often tragic. Several moments of tension appear across this history and demand distinct focus. One such moment occurred during a festival, when city drums masked footsteps and a procession doubly increased risk because of crowds, but also gave unusual cover. The operative had to push through throngs while a woman carrying a baby blocked a desired path, forcing a new plan that nearly failed when a guard recognized the operative by a scar. Another tense instant happened in a fortress, when a bolt was jammed and time ran thin before a torch revealed the intruder. The sound of metal against stone echoed like accusation, and the operative thought of names they had left behind, as if those names could save them. A third instance of pressure came after a betrayal, when a client sold out those he had hired and a sweep of arrests closed the network. The feeling in the cellars was of cold stone and older spiders, and the slow drip of water like a metronome counting the time left to make a pact or to confess. Each moment shows how quickly plans recalibrated under stress, and how human error or luck could change outcomes. Technical procedures were a backbone of the trade and merit discrete explanation in several short passages. One procedure involved creating a plausible corpse removal sequence. The crew would arrange bedding around a stretcher smeared with scented oil, then move the body during pre-dawn hours through service stairs, then load it into a cart that usually carried fish or hides to mask the odor. This required coordination of at least 3 people and timing with market deliveries. Another procedure concerned poison testing. A small animal would be given a measured dose, then observed. Then the practitioner tuned the preparation to avoid immediate agonizing death, which could attract attention rather than a subtle failure. A third procedure described the logistics of payment. Coin was verified by weight, scratched with a file to test for core of copper under silver, then stored in sealed clay jars labeled with innocuous phrases before being handed to intermediaries.
Technical note: reduced mystery to craft. Communities reacted in complex ways. Some celebrated successful removals that removed a tyrant. Others mourned loved ones and demanded justice. Chroniclers recorded public processions and quiet fires lit in remembrance. Lordships used victories as propaganda and hidden killings as political tools. Guilds sometimes punished members who hired killers, but often turned blind eyes when leadership benefited. The people who lived beside the acts often had to make moral calculations about survival and about whether it was better to speak or to stay silent. 1 month after a high-profile killing, a city huddled in rumors, and rumors hardened into lists of suspects. Families were watched more closely, and markets felt a careful tension. 3 months later, laws were adjusted, a patrol increased, and a public execution changed the mood, but not the practice, because need persisted. 6 months later, power had shifted in subtle ways. Alliances rearranged, and descendants told altered stories that turned killers into ghosts and into mythic figures. The epilogue here must span 3 moments to show the unfolding. In the first moment, survivors picked through ruins, small shops reopened with new owners, and a widow receiving coin in secret while children returned to school with a sudden hush around certain names. The second moment showed legal changes. A new ordinance required gate scribe signatures and mandated rosters for servants. This was a state effort to impose order, but it pushed the practice sideways into more clandestine paths. The third moment looked longer term. The memory of the event became a political tool. A tale used in sermons and town criers trimmed facts into moral lessons, and the actual people who did the work became whisper names in taverns, not heroes or villains, but instruments of stability or disruption depending on the teller. Across these months, reputations were rewritten and the practice adapted. Historical sources remain fragmentary, but enough exists to build a plausible map. Chroniclers list names of victims and suspects. Legal rolls record payments to informants, and archaeological evidence, like knives hidden in wall cavities or patched garments with strange stains, corroborate narratives. Experts, such as archivists and conservators, provide assessments that are cautious and conservative but point to patterns. Forensic analysis of wounds on skeletal remains reveals angles and force consistent with small, close attacks rather than open battle wounds, supporting the picture of stealth operations. Academic studies emphasize networks of cooperation rather than lone wolves. The synthesis of textual and material evidence yields a complex world where moral lines blur as easily as bloodstains on a cloth. In the end, The Dark Side You Never Knew is not merely a catalog of murders, but a mirror into how societies function when official channels fail to serve everyone. It shows how skills travel from craft to covert work, how ordinary objects, such as a peddler's basket or a laundress basket, can conceal lethal intent, how communities adapt by building rituals and informal economies to absorb the effects. Across these months, reputations were rewritten and the practice adapted. Historical sources remain fragmentary, but enough exists to build a plausible map. Chroniclers list names of victims and suspects. Legal rolls record payments to informants, and archaeological evidence, like knives hidden in wall cavities or patched garments with strange stains, corroborate narratives. Experts, such as archivists and conservators, provide assessments that are cautious and conservative but point to patterns. Forensic analysis of wounds on skeletal remains reveals angles and force consistent with small, close attacks rather than open battle wounds, supporting the picture of stealth operations. Academic studies emphasize networks of cooperation rather than lone wolves. The synthesis of textual and material evidence yields a complex world where moral lines blur as easily as bloodstains on a cloth. In the end, The Dark Side You Never Knew is not merely a catalog of murders, but a mirror into how societies function when official channels fail to serve everyone. It shows how skills travel from craft to covert work, how ordinary objects, such as a peddler's basket or a laundress basket, can conceal lethal intent, how communities adapt by building rituals and informal economies to absorb the effects.
The story leaves us with a thought to carry forward. 1 month after the last recorded event, the city still carried the smell of wet stone and coal, but people conversed more carefully in markets. 3 months later, the law book had new margins annotated in a clerk's hand, and the patrol schedule had shifted to dawn rounds. 6 months later, children played near the river and asked questions about the men who used to walk at night, and elders told stories that smoothed the edges of cruelty into lessons. If you found this exploration revealing, tell me in the comments which detail surprised you most and where you are watching from, so this community can map its interest. If you appreciate deep dives into history and want more investigations into the objects and people who shaped the past, subscribe to the channel to keep learning with us. History is messy and human, and often much more about the small choices and the quiet transactions than about the grand gestures. Until the next story, keep the lights low and the questions ready.